Hello, I'm Bart van Ark and I'm Chief Economist at the Conference Board. Today I'm joined by two of my economist colleagues for a 15-minute discussion on what is in store for the economy and the policy agenda of the incoming Trump administration, what the implications are for the state of the economy in the coming years. This video is an intro into a larger discussion at a webcast by the Conference Board in our series Windows on America, of which the third will be broadcasted on January 30th at 10 a.m. Eastern. Today I will speak with Joe Minarek, who's Senior Vice President and Director of Research at the Committee for Economic Development at the Conference Board. He joins us from Washington, D.C. And Brian Shaitkin, Senior Economist with the TCB's economics team here in New York. So let's dive in right away. The main reasons why the markets have reacted positively to the new administration is because of the potential for a fiscal stimulus through tax cuts and through infrastructure spending. And also the possibility of a large, clean sweep of regulations. So to begin with the first issue, fiscal stimulus, Joe, what will be the nature of the fiscal stimulus? When can we expect it? And what are the hurdles?
The administration has talked about fiscal stimulus through both tax cuts and spending increases. Talking about taxes first. The candidate talked about a huge tax cut for the middle class. Once taxpayers begin to smell a tax cut coming, they really want it, and it becomes politically perilous to oppose it. And the congressional budget processes are set up in such a way that a tax cut would not be subject to a filibuster in the Senate. So that would tend to make a tax cut move more quickly. There are some roadblocks, however. For one thing, the administration does not yet have named any tax experts to its policy team. The Congress has already discussed tax cuts last year in the election campaign. They have a proposal on the table. It's very different from the one that the administration has talked about. So the administration and the Congress are going to have to get on the same page. That may not necessarily be easy. And there is a contingent of members of Congress who are concerned about the budget deficit and the accumulated debt. And that means that a big tax cut can conceivably be a negative to them. How are they going to react? We don't really know. Spending side. The administration has talked about big investments in infrastructure, including the wall on the Mexico border, but beyond that, nationwide roads, other public facilities. They've talked about big spending on enforcing immigration rules. They've also talked about a major increase in defense spending. So there's actually a big increase in spending on tap. The problem with that is, again, this contingent in the Congress and in the Republican Party who are very concerned about the budget deficit and the debt. Where are they going to come up with the spending offsets so that the budget is not adversely affected? And of course, if they do, that neutralizes some of the other stimulus that we would otherwise be counting on. And then there's one last point, which is that a big stopper in the pipeline for legislation right now is the campaign to repeal Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act. And if that is the highest priority, that actually can stand in the way of a lot of the other stimulus-oriented legislative initiatives.
Brian, what are the prospects of a fiscal stimulus helping growth? At the Conference Board, our forecast for the United States is up a little, a few percentage points for GDP growth. Would it really be that small, that effect of the fiscal stimulus, or is it perhaps something that's coming later down the road in 2018?
Let's take the three pieces of Trump's fiscal expansion plan Joe described one at a time to understand why the Conference Board calls for a very modest increase in our growth forecast for 2017. First of all, in terms of corporate taxes, a tax cut would generally result in an increase in investment, but it's unclear what exactly the nature of that tax cut will be and how well the new policy regime will do in terms of boosting investment as opposed to other possible uses of repatriated profits such as stock buybacks and also dividend payments. Second, looking at the individual tax cuts, these are going to be more towards higher income individuals than lower income individuals. Higher income individuals have less of a propensity to spend out of income, so therefore a tax cut more targeted towards lower income workers would have more of a tendency to boost consumption. So therefore we expect a relatively small impact there. Finally, turning to infrastructure spending, as Joe correctly mentioned, it's going to take some time to get these projects online, so the real economic effect of them will not be felt until 2018. All in all, we expect a small boost over our previous forecast from both consumption and investment, but a relatively small one in 2017. And we'll have to see in 2018 whether the infrastructure spending in an environment of tight labor markets can actually provide the type of boost that the administration envisions them providing.
So let's move on to the next topic, regulation, which seems a big deal in businesses' mind. There is a sense that under the Obama administration, the regulatory burden has hugely increased. So Joe, President-elect Trump is talking of vastly correcting this. What exactly is the nature of this change? Where will he start? How quickly can this all go?
When we're talking about regulation more than anything else in this big area, we really are getting into the law and conceivably even into the courts. Many regulations are mandated by law or at least allowed by law, particularly with those that are mandated on existing rules. The administration, if it decides to rescind existing regulations, could be called into court. In terms of new regulations that have not yet been issued, the administration can conceivably drag its feet on doing so. But again, at some point, someone with legal standing could take the administration to court on the ground that an existing law requires that a regulation be issued. Rescinding existing regulations can be very difficult to do for the same reason. You don't know how quickly the courts can act. You don't know how aggressively courts may conceivably decide. But this is one area where it may be more difficult than you would anticipate, that an administration aiming towards deregulation would actually be able to execute that agenda.
Brian, not all regulations are bad, and it obviously depends on your perspective. For example, some regulations serve incumbent businesses, simply leading to redistribution rather than to more growth. So there's also the question about smart regulation. So what should the administration do in order to really get growth from changes in regulation?
Bart's framing is exactly right. The question is not more or less regulation, but whether a regulation contributes to growth and good outcomes or not. Is it a good regulation, or does it not serve the purpose it's envisioned to serve? And so let's talk about two areas of regulation that are likely to receive substantial attention from the new administration: banking and healthcare. On banking, financial stocks reacted buoyantly after the election because of the possibility that Dodd-Frank may be repealed or otherwise amended in such a way that banks will be able to take more risks, leading to possibly higher profits. On the other hand, over the long term, this creates a more risky environment, possibly leading to a replay of a 2008 crash scenario. So that should be a concern for the long-term outlook of the economy. Turning to healthcare, insurers have spent years adapting to the Affordable Care Act environment, and they are perfectly capable of adapting to a new regulatory scheme that Republicans in Congress and the president may come up with going forward as well. The question is, how long will the interregnum between those two schemes be, and will that disruption make life difficult for the healthcare industry? And finally, the new administration should really be focused on how do we build regulation in novel areas such as around the use of artificial intelligence by business, so that firms can take advantage of digital technology to boost growth into that 3 to 4% range that they are targeting. This is the most likely path towards having that sort of high growth that the administration has set out as a major policy goal.
Finally, let's briefly talk about what worries multinational businesses most, and that is the possibility of increased protection going to hurt foreign businesses and multinational businesses. Joe, it's difficult at this moment to see how trade policy exactly will play out, and the appointments in key positions such as commerce and trade and state that suggest that different scenarios are possible. But if the president follows through on all this, what scenarios do you see possibly emerge?
Trade is one of the areas where the president actually has the most authority that he can exert on his own. Many existing trade agreements give the president and the heads of other countries the option of opting out of an existing agreement. There are provisions in existing trade agreements that give the president the option of imposing tariffs if he declares that there is some kind of economic emergency. These kinds of steps could conceivably be challenged in court, but the track record indicates that the courts are very reluctant to contradict the president when he says there is an economic emergency. Now, this also runs the possibility of finding yourself afoul of the World Trade Organization. It is conceivable that the World Trade Organization could react to, say, an emergency tariff on the part of the president by allowing other countries to impose their own tariffs in retaliation. So we could actually have a legally blessed trade war. That's conceivable, and it's a very risky operation. The president certainly has suggested that he's not interested in engaging in new agreements, which would be unfortunate in not opening further the opportunities to trade. It is, of course, the case that a president could decide to use the threat of not participating or the threat of imposing tariffs to try to get better deals out of other countries. Substantively speaking, this president and his appointees have talked about the possibility of trying to move in a more bilateral rather than a multilateral direction to get new agreements that might facilitate trade. However, of course, the number of agreements that would be necessary if we negotiated on a bilateral rather than a multilateral basis could conceivably clog the diplomatic pipeline. So we could go in a lot of directions. Most of the scenarios that you'd see on the basis of the president's pronouncements do not appear to be highly favorable to opening up new channels of trade.
Brian, until a year ago, it was hard to find an economist to not argue fervently in favor of free trade. And now we suddenly see a whole bunch of economists to come out of the closet and say that we actually ignored some of the downsides here. And that will obviously have its effects on policy makers on the left and on the right side of the spectrum. So should business worry that the climate for doing business globally will deteriorate? And what is the best line of defense?
It's too soon to say. I think economists have had to confront the fact that over the past year, while the benefits from global trade for consumers and for businesses are quite dramatic, in addition to that, workers in fields exposed to strong international trade and also exposed to automation have suffered greatly. And this has in part fueled the rise of populism, not just in the US, but also globally. So that has definitely caused economists to revisit their position on trade, and has also resulted in a debate around trade that the president-elect took advantage of during the election that led in part to him taking a more aggressive position in terms of trade negotiation and contemplating the idea of raising tariffs, which rightly has worried businesses. However, President-elect Trump may find that this is quite an expensive solution, not just because it will cause businesses to have to pay more for imported goods, but also because it could disrupt supply chains and leave U.S. firms much less competitive and also impose substantial costs on consumers. So we may adopt something that we've seen during his period as president-elect, which is what I like to call the politics of the grand gesture, where rather than adopting actual tariffs, which as we've mentioned are quite expensive, you'll see individual actions such as what you saw around United Technology, where the president uses the bully pulpit in order to criticize the behavior of firms that he disapproves of, specifically the tendency of firms to move jobs out of the United States for whatever business reasons they may be making that decision for. But it's going to be interesting to see whether the president actually takes substantive action beyond trying to use moral suasion in order to change the behavior of American business.
Okay, well, thank you, Joe Minerick, Brian Shaken, for this interesting insights. We'll have a longer discussion with colleagues of the Conference Board and the Committee for Economic Development on what's in store in the first 100 days of the Trump administration, and we'll do that on January 30th at 10 a.m. Eastern. That's a webcast open for everyone, so you can register at the website address that is being shown. Finally, I also like to put in a plug for a new book coming from the Committee for Economic Development at the occasion of its 75th birthday, and is co-authored by Joe Minerick and Steve Otland, and it's called Sustaining Capitalism, with the subtitle Bipartisan Solutions to Restore Trust and Prosperity. Well, that's a very appropriate piece of reading in those interesting times. You can go to the CED website or to Amazon or Barnes & Nobles to get your copy. Thank you. See you next time for one of TCB's upcoming webcast or videos, or go to our website, tcb.org, to download past recordings or other materials.